Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti. Sono davvero felice che possiamo ricominciare i nostri incontri. Permettetemi subito di ringraziare gli amici di ACME che sono qui presenti e che sono un po' una colonna del museo per tutto quello che fanno con noi quotidianamente, per come ci aiutano nella gestione delle sale, come ci aiutano nella biblioteca e come ci aiutano soprattutto a fare questa importantissima programmazione che è la programmazione delle conferenze del Museo Egizio. Quindi ringrazio e ci onorerà della sua presenza anche il professor Prada, presidente di ACME, perché anche quest'anno, grazie ad ACME, assieme al Museo Egizio e con la collaborazione del Dipartimento degli Studi Storici, abbiamo un programma di conferenze che possiamo offrire a tutti voi. È un programma molto denso ed è molto denso anche perché quest'anno è l'anno del bicentenario, ci accingiamo a festeggiare il bicentenario e mettendo le comunicazioni scientifiche sia di colleghi e di amici che vengono dall'Italia e dall'estero, sia del personale del Museo Egizio, per far vedere in che direzione sta andando la ricerca all'interno del museo, è un qualcosa per noi molto importante. Cambio l'idioma di espressione all'inglese, così anche il nostro ospite ci può comprendere. Avete, per chi ne avesse bisogno, c'è un servizio di traduzione simultanea e quindi potete seguire. So, welcome, Xavier. It's a great pleasure and an honor to have you here tonight. And to start with you the new series of conferences and lectures in the museum. I just said that we organize our lectures in cooperation with the friends and collaborators of the Museo Egizio. So thanks to them, thanks to university, the Department of Historical Studies and the Museo Egizio, we also have this year very varied and let's say with multiple voices that will tell our public what we do, and it's very important that scholars like you, and I thank you for that, are willing to come and talk about their research. Just a few words to present our speaker tonight. Dr. Xavier Drew is the founder of the Predynastic Online database. He's the curator of the collection of Egyptian archaeology at the Fondation Gandour in Geneva, and is an external collaborator of the University of Geneva in the Laboratory of Archaeology of African Anthropology. As a Swiss graduate of the University of Geneva, Xavier benefited from a full scholarship from the Barrow Foundation and wrote his doctoral dissertation at the University of Oxford on riverine and desert animals in pre-dynastic Upper Egypt, material culture and final remains, working with Professor Baines and Dr. René Friedman, and he himself has also been a senior member of the excavation in Hierakonpolis, directed by Dr. René Friedman. In Sudan, Xavier Drew is the co-director of the Swiss-French-Sudanese mission at Kerma Dokigel, together with Séverine Marchi. And I suppose at the moment the situation is rather difficult, but unfortunately the global situation is rather complex at the moment. We are very glad that is here with us tonight to offer us a lecture giving an overview on the abundant predynastic material dating to the 1st millennium BC. I see Dr. Uliano is the curator of the predynastic collection, smiling and glowing for your presence. So without any further ado, I give the word for you, thanking you for being here and for shedding light in this very important part of Egyptian civilization, and also a part of our collection which sometimes is not understood in its fully potential, at least by the large public. So thank you again, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Greco, for your very kind and generous introduction and invitation to come here to Turin tonight to speak and address your audience. Thank you very much to the organizing committee and Luigi Prada as well for this invitation and helping me getting here in one piece by train earlier today. As you just said, actually the stakes are quite high when you're the first speaker of a whole series of lectures, but at least we start with the beginning of time, which is actually quite a nice way to do it. So, as you said as well, it's a period of Egyptian history that is far less trendy than, say, the time of Cleopatra, the time of Tutankhamun. It's also far less publicized, maybe the microphone, thank you, far less publicized in museums or TV programs than other periods of Egyptian history, or say, mysteries of the mummies and the gold of the pharaohs, and so forth. So tonight, if you would like to follow me, I would invite you on a travel back in time to this very remote period of pre-dynastic Egypt, and we will look at some of what happened on the shores of the River Nile in the 4th millennium BC in Egypt. In this lecture, I would like first to spend a few moments to think about the notion of art in pre-dynastic Egypt before looking at the history of pre-dynastic studies. It's not for the sake of historiography. It's not for the sake of historiography itself, but you will see that the groundbreaking work that was carried out in the late 19th century or the early 20th century were crucial for our understanding of the internal evolution of the pre-dynastic period, with the establishment of relative chronologies which are still in use today. But material originating from these old excavations, and sometimes from newer ones too, carries their own sets of issues. I will present to you the collaborative online platform Panda.org, just mentioned by Dr. Greco a second ago, which I have developed with the aim of bringing modern solutions to old problems. In doing so, we will also look more closely at a specific category of pre-dynastic artifacts, that of white-painted seaware vessels. So where did this art develop? Where did these people we speak about tonight? Because behind objects, we always have to think about the people who were there, the people who created these objects. We have to remember that we are on the African continent, on this northeastern corner of the African continent. And when we speak about Egyptology, we very often think of links with the ancient Near East, and we sometimes tend to forget links with what was happening further south in Africa. It's perhaps my work in Sudan now, which makes me more aware of that fact. But of course, it's not the subject or the core subject of tonight's lecture, but I think it's always important to remember the context and the people associated with the object and the material culture we might see in museums or speak about in a lecture. Indeed, landscape is very important if we want to understand pre-dynastic iconography. On the one hand, you have the River Nile, the lush environment on its shores, and on the other hand, the desert environment. And so it is along the Nile, and in its immediate vicinity of the floodplain that cultures developed during the 5th and the 4th millennia BC. In Upper Egypt, a number of important localities emerged in the southern part of the country, such as Abydos, Nakada, and Hierakonpolis, and a number of others, of course, as well. But before looking at these objects, we have to wonder, can we speak about ancient Egyptian or even pre-dynastic art? So you will, I hope, excuse me for quoting an information panel I took note several years ago in one of my previous visits here in the Museo Egizio. I don't know if it's still actually on display in the galleries. And I'm not going to read the whole text to you. Of course, it's quite a long text. But is there an ancient Egyptian or pre-dynastic art, or is it just craftsmanship? I think what I take, because I'm not an art historian myself, so I don't want to insult anybody, any art historian with my own views, but my personal view is that what I take from that information panel that is probably the last sentence. One needs a certain familiarity with specific cultural context of Egyptian art to really understand it. And I think it's even more true for pre-dynastic art, which is even different from Egyptian art. And it's only by looking very much in depth and at length to this pre-dynastic art that we can try, well, we can begin to understand it and understand it for what I think it is, art. Another much shorter quote by David Wengrow, which I'm not 100% sure on how to interpret correctly, but to me, to say that there is, that the term of pre-dynastic art has little meaning outside the context of the art market and the specialized disciplinary conventions of art history is not something I feel very strongly about myself, because I feel that it's a very modern view that we apply on ancient people. And I think we have to be careful. Yes, people back then, 6,000 years ago, lived very differently from we did. People who produced these artworks did so in a very different way. And I don't think it means that they were lesser artists than today, even if the word would mean very different concepts back in the days. And it's quite surprising in publications, and even when we speak as pre-dynastic specialists, we have no problem using the word artwork, especially when objects are in a museum. But very rarely will you hear the word the artist. It will be the craftsman, it will be the painter, the flint knapper, something I tend to do myself, actually. But I think we have to be a bit more open-minded to the idea that there were artists in that period, because these objects, some of these objects I will present to you tonight, were actually the most complex figural representations produced at that time, anywhere. So you will hear me say the words art and artist tonight. So I said I would look a little bit at the history of our field of study. And although the study of pre-dynastic Egypt is concerned about much older period than some of my Egyptologists colleagues here, you might be surprised to realize that it's actually a much more recent field of study. Of course, you heard all about the beginning of Egyptology last year when we celebrated the 200 years of Jean-François Champollion deciphering hieroglyphs, thanks to the Rosetta Stone found during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt in the late 18th century, if I'm correct. You can see here a beautiful representation of Champollion, which was drawn during his campaign in Egypt. But at that time, the idea that there was a prehistory or pre-dynastic periods in Egypt was totally unknown. If we want to look at the origins of pre-dynastic Egypt as a field of study, we have first to look at what was happening in Europe, perhaps surprisingly. And the development of the prehistory research in itself. The very existence of these most ancient periods ran actually contrary to Christian beliefs and the authority of the church, and were a tricky subject to navigate. And antiquities, qualified then as antediluvian, were first published by Jacques Boucher de Perthes, a Frenchman, only in 1846. He described stone tools he had found in two French localities that are quite famous till today for prehistory, Abbeville and Saint-Acheul. However, his discoveries were not accepted widely as authentic for another 13 years. And 13 years brings us to the year 1859, when Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, that most fundamental of scientific books, and whereby Christian view of the history of the world was definitely undermined. But what about the prehistory, especially in Egypt? Well, you still have to wait for a bit, since it's only 10 years later, in 1869, that a Frenchman called Adrien Arcelin collected stone tools at several places in the Nile Valley, and particularly in the Valley of the Kings. He recognized them as prehistoric, and by coincidence, the same year, just slightly later in the year, two other Frenchmen, Ernest Ami and François Lenormand, together found similar tools on the west bank of the Nile opposite Luxor. All three Frenchmen were certain that they had found prehistoric remains attesting to the earliest presence of humans in Egypt. But their opinion did not meet general approval among Egyptologists, except perhaps for Gaston Maspero, who was more nuanced than some of his colleagues. A shift occurred only in 1895, when Jacques de Morgan finally became convinced of that very old age of this material. These tools were, for some of them, of Paleolithic age and were found high up on the western hills of the desert plateau, outside of any proper archaeological context, as we would like to understand it. So when it comes to archaeology of pre-dynastic Egypt, let's look at what happened on British excavation and not so much French excavation for a moment. In 1894, so just before de Morgan understood the fact that these things were very ancient, two British colleagues, William Matthew Flinders Petrie and James Edward Quibble, together with a small team of researchers, embarked on a joint expedition on the west bank of the Nile. They surveyed and excavated a 30-kilometer-long stretch of the low desert in an area between Luxor and Kenna, in the vicinity of a small village that has since become eponymous with pre-dynastic cultures, the village of Nakada. A lot of archaeological work had taken place before and since Petrie's time in that region, with a number of archaeological sites and localities identified. You can see on this Google Earth view a large red rectangle, which is where Petrie himself excavated. Quibble worked just further north in the area nearer the village of Balas. In 3 months, they excavated no less than 3,000 tombs in several cemeteries and explored settlement areas, finding remains of various periods of ancient Egyptian history. Luckily for us, they adopted a novel and scientific approach for their work and wrote field notes about a large number of tombs where the plan of the tomb was sketched and its content indicated quite summarily, but still indicated. Petrie stressed the importance of writing notes during excavations, and he said, speaking about other sites that had contained similar material of what he found at Nakada, he wrote, "But no description of the burials or record of the graves was made, and the history was destroyed, as it always must be when a recorder is not on the spot." And that remains true today. A lot of our work as archaeologists in the field is to actually write down what we observe, what we see, before it disappears and is destroyed. In a sense, he is considered, perhaps quite rightly, as a father of modern archaeology, at least in the British world, so I'm not sure if everybody agrees with that. So we are lucky that Petrie and his colleagues took that novel approach with our excavation notebooks. Yet, 130 years later, these notebooks are not yet fully published. Although not all of them survive today, they are full of important information that is absolutely worth exploiting. But one of the difficulties that may explain why they haven't been published yet is the sheer quantity of work that would be required. No less than 980 tombs are at least sketched and planned in the surviving notebooks. Another difficulty, as you might see from that slide on the right-hand side, it's a page from Petrie's notebook, is his handwriting, which is extremely difficult to read. Even when we spend a lot of time looking at his document, it's still very difficult. He uses a lot of abbreviations that can be very confusing at times, and words that are very, very difficult to read. So there are good reasons why that work has not been done yet. As to the material culture or the artifacts they found in these tombs, they were of a great variety. Grauwacke palettes, a type of mudstone, the most exquisite of which were shaped as animals. You can see, for example, on the top left, a Barbary sheep. These palettes were extremely numerous and found in most of the tombs. They were not the animal-shaped ones, but more as an object, palettes were found in most of the tombs. And they were a commodity used by most people, probably in pre-dynastic Egypt. The fancier ones, of course, were reserved for certain elites. The most common ceramics were red and black, or just red, sometimes more rarely just black. Their surfaces beautifully polished to a shine. Exceptionally, they were painted with vibrant white figures or geometric designs. Other painted ceramics were of a beige fabric, adorned with red motifs that looked very different to those painted in white. Lithic material was quite abundant, with extremely fine examples showing a mastery in the art of flint knapping, such as this fishtail knife blade on the bottom in the center. The finds were presented in a printed report in 1896, and you can see here other types of objects from the plates, such as ivory combs, tusks, tags, and pins, or a spoon in the bottom with beautifully carved animals. Artifacts in organic materials were luckily often very well preserved despite their age. So it does boggle the mind of a modern archaeologist, really, when you realize that on this plan, which I prepare for a forthcoming publication, each dot represents a tomb, and that all of that work was done in less than 12 weeks. And this is only Petrie's area. You still have Quibel's area, where that was running at the same time with hundreds of other tombs. In all, thousands of objects and ceramics were recorded in their graves, with a huge quantity then packed up and sent to the United Kingdom. Most of them are found today in the Ashmolean Museum at the University of Oxford, and a lot, of course, also in the Petrie Museum at University College London. Having done quite a lot of research on the distribution of some of these finds, they are literally found on, except Antarctica, every continent and in dozens of museums. It's quite tricky to try to keep track of all the work they did. Of course, the notebooks I mentioned do not meet today's criteria or expectations in terms of the level of detail they contain or the precision of the drawings. Errors were made, sometimes quite significant mistakes, but this is quite understandable when you realize the speed at which they had to work, the pressure that had been on their shoulders during that time. But they must have nevertheless been a great help when Petrie redacted his report in 1896 together with his colleagues. So can we consider that Petrie is the official discoverer of pre-dynastic Egypt? Well, yes and no. Let me explain. You will remember that the presence of prehistoric man in Egypt only became accepted in 1895. So in the time between Petrie concluded his excavation at Nakada and the time he published his report. So it's really happening right there. It's kind of the hot topic of the day. And Petrie himself had questioned why no traces of this childhood of Egyptian art and civilization had been found. And yet, to interpret his discoveries, that's quite difficult when you have very few parallels, when you are the first one to find that type of material. And he had only very few parallels to build any interpretation on. Indeed, this material culture he uncovered at Nakada, which is so different from what he knew, or from what anybody knew from historical pharaonic sites, was, however, not totally entirely new. Antiquities dealers and local employees of the Giza Museum had already recovered a large amount of this type of material during the previous decade, especially at sites like Shozam, and Jebel Ain, and in smaller quantities at a number of other sites ranging from Sohag to Komombo in Upper Egypt. The absence of proper recording of these excavations, or I dare say plundering, isolated these objects from their original context so that they could not be properly assessed in order to identify their date or cultural origin. You have a citation here from Petrie's publication and report, in which he is mostly right, except for one word, when he says that these classes of foreign things are so these classes of foreign things are no isolated matter, but belong to a large population spread over the whole of Upper Egypt. That's almost all correct, except for one word, foreign, or So it's quite understandable to make a mistake like that, given the novelty of what he found, the lack of recognizable, what would have been expected Egyptian characters in this material. And he came up with the idea of a new race. That's his words, we're in the late 19th century, not my word. And the tone was set from the first page of his introduction and was developed quite at length in the conclusion of the volume. In Petry's view, this was a group of invaders who came into Egypt between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. So he found amazing stuff, but kind of messed up his interpretation. The fact that these remains were not the product of a hypothetical foreign invaders, but of the prehistoric predecessors of the pharaonic Egyptians, was understood rather rapidly by a Frenchman, Jacques de Morgan, again, we already heard his name. And he published his conclusions in 1896 in his famous Recherches sur les origines de l'Égypte. We can only barely imagine how Petry and his colleagues must have felt to be corrected so swiftly and so definitely by French colleagues. Nothing better than a bit of French-British competition in the world of archaeology, or elsewhere in the world indeed. But to his credit, Petry may have made a huge interpretative mistake, of course, with his imagined new race, but he was very quick in admitting that he was wrong. That's already fair. And he also kept working on the subject in a systematic way that was unequaled at the time. He pursued large-scale excavations of pre-dynastic sites further north of Nakada, for example, here in the region of Diospolis Parva, later on in 1898, 1899. And in that report, published in 1901, so we're still just a few years after his initial excavation at Nakada, he included a first comprehensive classification of pre-dynastic pottery. And you can see here how his brain works, and you will see more of it in a second. You have to organize, categorize, put things in boxes, and organize and order them. He grouped his potteries in classes, in 9 classes that actually are still in use today, although some changes and modifications have happened since we have learned a few things in the last century or so. In each class, these classes are based mostly on the fabric and the technology of the ceramics, and then within each class, the shapes were given separate numbers, and then he was trying to order them and see how shapes could have evolved over time. So Petry's aim was trying to understand how pre-dynastic times, although he didn't know how ancient it was, there was no carbon-14, for example, to help him, but he was trying to see how things could have been organized and have evolved over time. You have, for example, what we call the fine wares, which can have this black top or can be plain red, sometimes plain black, which are made of Nile mud, polished, heavily polished, sometimes almost shiny. Sometimes with this white decoration, which becomes a class of its own, the seaware. You can have, for example, in the bottom left, what he called the wavy handled jars, for obvious reasons. You can see these lovely little wiggly handles of the jars. And other types of ceramics, I don't want to go through all of them, but he really tried to categorize all these things. But he went much further than that, and he almost created Excel before the time of computers and spreadsheets before they were trendy. What he did was, for each tomb he excavated in which he thought there was enough ceramics in place, he made a little slip, one single line of paper, first column, the tomb number, and then each column for each paper is the same. You have the different types of his ceramics. And in each column, he wrote the number of these shapes. And then with these slips, he must have spent an insane amount of time trying to figure out which ceramic shapes happened at the same time as the others, or perhaps later, or perhaps before, and moving these slips on wooden boards. And that's how he came up with the very first chronology of the pre-dynastic period. Of course, it's still a relative chronology. We're still way before science could bring any hard date. But he could understand that there were three main phases of development of the pre-dynastic period, and he gave them names according to archaeological sites. The first one he called the Amratian, according to the site of El Amra, Gerzean, the site of El Gerza, and Semanian, the site of El Semania. I have no idea how to pronounce that word correctly, I'm afraid. And then what he did, kind of like the ceramics, he makes big categories and then subdivisions. He did the same, and he subdivided that period in over 80, what he called sequence dates, so little units of chronological periods, and then he assigned them to these different periods. So Amratian is sequence date 30 to 37, for example. And why did he not start with one? Because wisely enough, and he was right in the end, he thought that other people might find earlier traces of Egyptian development than he had. So he made sure to leave some free space so that his system could survive later discoveries. And then in the 20th century, two main scholars, a lot of people have worked, of course, on chronology and using their finds to try to refine chronologies, but the two main scholars to have done so are Werner Kaiser and Stan Hendricks. From Werner Kaiser's work, you see the Badarian appear. That's what happens in the 5th millennium BC in Egypt, so before the pre-dynastic in a sense. And he divided his chronology in three different Stufen. He's a German scholar, German-speaking scholar. So the idea that there were three main phases of development remains valid. So Petrie was right in the end. And Stan Hendricks, in his refinements later on, kept also that the division in three main phases. But from now on, we speak of Nakada, even with Kaiser, we speak of Nakada Stufen or Nakada phases. And in a way, it's very surprising that Petrie did not use the site of Nakada to name one of his periods, since the first site where he found all that pre-dynastic material. So I don't know, was he still perhaps a bit vexed about his first misinterpretation and French corrections? I don't know. But now, really, Nakada has become eponymous with pre-dynastic cultures in Upper Egypt. What happens with Stan Hendricks, of course, we are much closer to our own time today, is that he tries to anchor these relative chronologies in hard dates, in real or, numbered years, absolute chronology. It's still a bit vague, and for good reason, because it's only 10 years ago, in 2013, that colleagues at the University of Oxford, directed by Michael Dee, made the first wide-ranging study in terms of scientific studies to obtain carbon-14 dates from artifacts in museums in Europe and elsewhere, coming from documented excavations of pre-dynastic sites. But if you include the Badarian, it's almost 1,500 years that we try to cover in that little tableau. And they made 100 carbon-14 tests, which is still very few compared to what would be needed if we wanted to have superfine chronologies. So there is still a lot of space for future works to develop and help us better understand these pre-dynastic chronologies. So, as I said earlier, or at the beginning of my talk, we will look a little bit more closely at one specific type of objects, because it's really at the basis of the Panda project I will speak at the end, and also it's beautiful objects, I love them, and they are some of the objects which inform us the most about the mindset of the ancient Egyptians at that time. These, what we call seaware vessels, were all produced in the earlier part of the pre-dynastic period, over a period of perhaps 400 years. So we call them seaware. It's a very scientific word that we use as specialists, which doesn't mean anything to anybody else, of course, in the world. It's an abbreviation. So the ware is a word that we use for the fabric of the material of these vessels. And the C comes from the abbreviation for cross. Because Petrie had named his wavy-handled jars W, he had used the W for these jars. He couldn't use the W for white again, so he chose to use a second letter. So it's all a bit confusing, but C-ware comes from the word white cross-lined, and the C of cross-lined became the abbreviation for that ware. It's a little bit of a mouthful to say white cross-lined vessel all the time. So if you will allow me, I will speak and use the abbreviation C-ware when possible. But to tell you what these letters actually mean doesn't tell you much about the objects themselves. So more interestingly, C-ware vessels are really just other fine wares, red polished or black-topped vessels, onto which people had painted white designs. It's always a little bit more complicated than that, because I would think about 98 or 99% of C-ware is actually painted on plain red vessels, but of course there are a few exceptions which were painted on black-topped ones. Why they did that? Difficult to know, but I think I know of less than 20 black-topped vessels out of a corpus of, say, 700 to 800 painted vessels. So it's really the exception. So perhaps it's actually informative that they decided to paint different vessels. Perhaps it's not. Perhaps it's taste, personal taste of the deceased who wanted that in his tomb, and perhaps it's more significant. It's always tricky to answer these questions. And Petrie's class is also problematic because not all C-ware are actually vessels. You have here two examples of rattles. So if you shake them, they would make noise. There are some stuff in them. I don't know what it is. So probably a toy or a musical instrument, we could imagine, which are made in the same technique and decorated in the same way. So it's hard to say that all C-ware is a vessel. It's hard to say that all C-ware is actually red vessels painted, because it's not. There are always exceptions. And when you look in the finer details, it's always a bit more complicated than we would like it to be. Another problem when we deal with this material in isolation, and we look just at C-ware vessels, for example, is that then we kind of no longer look at other types of decoration which were done at the same time and are extremely similar, but just done in a different technique. I show you here 4 objects which are not painted, but where the decoration has been incised. But the one on the left, which shows a Barbary sheep, you can see, I hope you can make out the shape of the animal that looks towards the right, and like crescent-shaped horns. That Barbary sheep would look almost exactly like a painted one. So again, why did somebody paint one and when did somebody incise one? We don't know. But if you look just at C-ware on its own, you might forget that you have other objects that would come into that same mindset, that same corpus of ideas, but just expressed in a different medium. In the center at the top, and unfortunately I don't have a good picture of it because I think it's a very cute one, is a red polished bowl on which the body of the silhouette of a hippopotamus has been incised. And again, something extremely similar to what you find in white painted decoration. And not just vessels have been incised, but also palettes. Quite rare, but you have an example here. Very difficult to make out exactly all the designs of these that are incised on the palettes, but there are most of them animals. I think on the top left is a dog. We can see toward the center in the top, again, the kind of crescent-shaped horns of what was a Barbary sheep. And this palette is interesting because we see that although it was decorated and incised, it was still being used to the point that most of the incisions have disappeared because of the repeated use and rubbing of material on the surface of the object. So you don't do that just because you want a pretty object in your tomb. You might have them in your house, you might use them in your life. And of course, yes, then they get brought to your tomb, or who knows, maybe 3 generations down the line, at some point somebody decides to bury that object. How do you make fine-ware vessels in pre-dynastic Egypt? Well, all of them are made in principle in the same way for the first part. You go and you collect your Nile mud. You have to then probably prepare it and filter it to prepare the silt. And then you can, once you have your paste, the right consistency, you can start shaping your vessels, which you can do apparently in 2 different ways, by coiling. So you make like a coil that you build your vessel up with that coil, or more a free modeling technique. You apply a red hematite coat that will become bright red later in the firing process. And when the vessel has dried in the sun and kind of get the consistency of leather, you can then polish it, sometimes polish it extremely well, as you have seen on these examples. So all of that is done the same for all the fine wear vessels, and it's only the firing process that will be adapted, whether you want to produce just a plain red, a red and black one, or a complete black one. The black is not paint. The black is actually the result of putting part of your vessel, or all of it, within ash, probably in your kiln, and the lack of oxygen in contact with your vessel will turn it black. So for blacktop vessels, which are usually black at the top, you have to imagine them fired upside down in the kiln with parts buried in the ash. As for white painted vessels, it's exactly that, except that you add the stage of painting, of adding the white pigment to the surface. In most cases, we don't know if it's all the time, but in most cases, we can prove that it's done before firing. So when your vessel is ready, you paint it, and then you bring it to your kiln for firing it. And again, you can do it plain red or partly buried in your ash to turn it black-topped. Interestingly, on black-topped vessels, the black is never painted. So they must have been careful to not bury the white paint in the ash. It's probably, for technical reasons, probably they knew that if you buried your white paint, it wouldn't probably hold on the surface of the black or something. It's hard to know. But if you see a black-topped vessel with white decoration on the black and it has no provenance, I would invite you to consider that it might not be an authentic pre-dynastic vessel, for example. In their vast majority, these white cross-lined vessels are decorated with purely geometric designs. I show you a few examples here. Sometimes you have, like the top one in the center top one, what looks like a tree branch, perhaps. So perhaps one vegetal element included in a geometric decoration. It's very hard to then try to understand what these means. Do they have a meaning? Are they just nice? Are they just decorated with triangles, or do they have more of a meaning? It's very hard to say. That we don't have much to build a theory on. But before I move to the next slide, I would like you to look at all the different provenances or current locations of these objects. As I go through, you will see that they are literally in all museums, in all countries around the world, and that will be interesting for later on. In more exceptional circumstances, these ceramics were painted with figural elements, mostly animals, sometimes humans as well. And because I think we are all the same as humans, we will spend more time speaking about these than just triangles. And in the literature, you will have the impression, the reverse impression, that most of them are painted with animals and that there are a few just with triangles, because in publications, in catalogs, and in museums, the ones we would consider are nicer or more interesting will be given more prominence. But actually, it's an extreme minority of a few dozen objects out of a corpus of 7 or 8 or 900 vessels. And in fact, the fact that they're so rare is probably very significant. They're only found in the most, or the richer burials, we have to be careful with the meaning of that word, but the bigger burials, or those with the most material, or they are found in cemeteries which are exclusively reserved for the use of early or pre-dynastic elites. They are not done for anybody else. So why would the elite choose to use animals in their vessels? Is it because they liked animals and it's pretty? Well, we think in general that pre-dynastic art is much more symbolic than that. They don't tend to try to represent nature. They use nature, but not in a naturalistic way. These animals are almost exclusively wild, except for the dog. But the dog is not a pet you have in your home, it's your hunting companion. These wild animals are in most cases hunted, and sometimes not, but that's almost reserved to the hippopotamus, which himself is an animal treated very differently by the pre-dynastic Egyptians. On the vessels you see here, if you want to see a little bit how they paint as well, if you look at the hippos on the top left corner that are going nicely in a round in the vessel, they're extremely schematic. If you look at the one which is just a drawing on this one, which is in Princeton, you see again an animal with little crescent-shaped horns. Well, that's a Barbary sheep, and it's surrounded by dogs. That's one way to represent dog hunting. Early on, it was interpreted as, oh, that must be a female animal with its babies around it, but actually, we now understand it very differently. And if you look at the dogs in that drawing, or the vessel on the right-hand side, you can see that they have a little circle under the neck, which we could think, oh, it's a little bell. Well, I don't think it would make sense for a dog to have a bell around its neck if it wants to go hunting, because that would kind of defeat the point. But it's more likely to be a way of indicating that they have a collar and a knot at which you could attach the leash. So again, interesting aspects. It's not a naturalistic representation, but it does inform us about what they did and how they did it in these times. It's not naturalistic either, because if you look at the top left, in the lower part, you see hippopotami being hunted. So the hippopotamus, it's really my favorite animal, so I will try not to go too long on this animal. But this hippopotamus is the most fearsome and dangerous animal that you had in the Egyptian landscape. So hunting it was certainly not something you could do on your own. And here you see 3 hippopotami, each hunted by one guy. That's totally not realistic. That's because you want to show I am strong, I can show myself killing a hippo, but you would not be able to do that in real life. Hunting hippopotamus is usually seen as a community activity in a village. In Africa, even today, or in documented cases, photographed cases from, like, say, early 20th century. So it's not, again, exact reality that's being shown, and yet it's probably not a coincidence that hippos are always hunted with harpoons. We think it's harpoons, we just see the rope, really, that usually ends with a coil. It's not a coincidence that crocodiles are always shown with a net next to them, or that animals from the desert with the horns, Barbary sheep, the ibex, are always shown surrounded by dogs. So it's probably a reflection of how you hunt, and you have specific hunting techniques for different animals. That is probably a real fact. And when humans are shown being controlled, because they show their enemies as well, they are usually controlled with the mace. And mace heads have been found in quantity of burials in Egypt for pre-dynastic times, and clearly they were used as a weapon against other humans and not as a hunting tool, for example. So they do inform us about the lives of these people. I really think that if you want to understand these representations, a little bit what I said earlier on about understanding art is that you need a good understanding of the context, and for that you need to be able to access as many images as possible to try to get the wider view, the most extensive view of this material. And how can we do that? Well, that's very complicated. And that's where we can move on to the panda.org project, which I've developed, which came from a huge frustration, actually, as a student doing my doctoral thesis, where when you still had to start by looking at, say, Petrie's reports, or in this case, his corpus he published in 1921, look at these images and try to make sense of them. As you can see, he published 163 types of vessels, so it's already quite a number. You can do something with that. But all you have is an image and its number on the plate. You don't know where that vessel was found or where it might be. So you painstakingly take notes and try to compare with other publications and what you remember having seen in museums or exhibitions and catalogs and so on, and you try to figure things out. and you increase your information, and that's very helpful, but it's extremely time-consuming, and it felt to me that everyone was doing the same generation after generation. We start the same, we go back to Petri, and oh, I don't know where that vessel is. But there was no easy way to access that information that other people had already found somehow. And another problem with Petri is that also, well, the small scale of the drawings, of course. But he did not try to publish individual objects. His interest, remember, was in typologies and chronology primarily. And in these plates, if two seaware vessels were very similar, they would only appear as one number, and you would have no way to know if it's 1, 2, 3, 4 vessels that he used to make that model, or to which one of these actual vessels the published drawing might refer to. So you might get the impression, especially actually for towards the center of the page, you see kind of closed vessels, a bit oval vessels like that. It's hard to, for example, if you see number 64 on the plates, and you have the feeling that there are very few of these type of shapes, and actually they all look the same. So he only used one in his publication, and you realize that there are 4, 5, 6 of them in museums. So actually they are far more frequent than you would think. So when you look at actual objects and in museums and so on, you realize that we have a skewed view of this material all the way back from Petri's original publications. It was not his intention, of course, it's not a criticism of what he did, but his approach had a different goal than if I look at objects for themselves. Luckily for pre-dynastic specialists, our colleague Gwenella Graf published in 2009 a catalog that increased the corpus with 192, this time not types, but artifacts, 192 seaware vessels, individual objects, with a lot more information. You can see bigger images, so you can better understand what was published, what was drawn on these vessels, and she listed where these vessels came from, where they are found today. So it was a great start, but printed catalog have a massive downside, is that it's still expensive to print books, so you are limited by space. So the descriptions, for example, of the vessels is limited to a code that she uses for each type of object, and unless you use that kind of publication all the time, what is CR7? What is H8? I mean, you will always have to go back and forth to her description of each type at the beginning of the volume. So it's not user-friendly in a way, but for good reason, of course. The second problem is that you cannot make corrections, and objects, especially when they are not located when you publish them, might suddenly appear in a publication and you realize, oh, they are in this museum in Northern America that I had never heard about. But you cannot add that to your book, it's too late. And you cannot add new vessels found on excavations or new publications either. So once it's printed, it's kind of set in stone. And that's where I came up with the idea during my doctoral thesis that we needed something a bit more modern than a printed book. And I came up with the idea of an online platform that could allow to gather all this data. Of course, it needs to be also freely accessible. I'm very, very insistent on that. There will never be a fee while I'm alive on my platform to access it. Anybody can access it, and if you have a phone on you, I don't know if the reception is good in this room, but if you go online on www.panda.org, you can access that information. Everybody can access it. Of course, it's gonna be a huge endeavor. There are probably tens of thousands of artifacts that could end up on panda.org, and my life is way too short to deal with all of that myself. But I think we made a good start. And the first corpus I'm trying to put online is seaware vessels. That's why I wanted to speak more about them tonight. I think I have about 900 individual numbers of seaware vessels, but a lot of them are fragments, which are also very often missing or lacking from any publication. So it's quite interesting and useful to add fragments, which also give a lot of information. So the platform has been running for about a year now. And I will spare you the technical aspects of it. To me, coding to get to the point of getting a database and an online platform is, as close as it gets to witchcraft. So I certainly did not do that myself. But with that slide, I wanted to show you how much more interactive and fun it can be than a book, because you can click and navigate on the platform between a lot of different information, between publication to an object, to a person linked to that object, to an archaeological site where the object is from, to the museum where that object is located now. My aim is also to illustrate all these objects. It can be tricky with some collections. They don't want images, at least not for free, which I find always a bit sad to limit the diffusion of very ancient iconography, actually. But of course, that's open for debate, and every country has also different rules and laws that I'm trying to navigate in terms of copyright for all that stuff. I like to also try to really associate people with their objects, who excavated them, because Petrie excavation is not always Petrie who excavated. He had a team with him. So it's very difficult to get back to the level of knowing who were the Egyptian workmen actually finding the stuff in the tomb. But Petrie, in most cases, actually wrote who was the Egyptian in charge of each burial. So we can actually get to some degree to that level. But for that, you would need to go back to the notebook systematically, something I haven't done yet, for example, so you would not find that information on Ponda yet. But he also had European colleagues who were in charge of some excavation. They found the stuff and not Petrie. So it's important to try to give back to them the credit they deserve. In terms of how the database works, of course it could be seen as quite arcane and for the specialists, but I try to keep it accessible, not just freely accessible, but accessible in terms of the language used for the general public, and as many people can use it. So the description of the object, for example, is ad libitum and not code or anything like that, so you can read the description. And that allows you, of course, then to make searches by keyword and find objects. So you see an example here for the first vessels. They each receive a code as well, an individual code, to avoid doubling your vessels, which can be quite a tricky issue when you have an object found at a site, but you don't know where it is today, and a museum no longer knows where an object comes from. It could very well be the same object. So that requires research, contact with the museums, traveling to museums, to try to make sure we don't increase artificially the number of objects which are then identified by a unique number each for ease of reference as well. If you scroll down the page, virtually here, I wasn't sure if there would be any internet connection, so just by screenshots, we scroll down the page. We can put as much information as we want. We are not limited by space. So we can speak of all the different dimensions of the objects or any other type of information we would like to add. And of course then references, which I find is very important, because again, if I open a report published by Petrie and I have plate 23, the object 29, I want to be able to find that information, and you can come on this platform and look for Petrie's publication, and then you can find that number very easily rather than the other way around, as you would have to do on printed books. And because, again, there is no limitation, you can put literally every single publication of an object, every short article, every note in an article, or any publication, as well, of course, as the main ones, the original publications, for example, here by Petrie, that's an object that was found in Diospolis Parva. The references are also ordered in chronology, which I found quite interesting myself, even in my doctoral thesis, is to realize how the study of pre-Dynastic materials developed, and how much suddenly in the late 20th century you see an increase in publication of some types of objects, the most interesting ones I mentioned earlier, with humans and animals, for example, and they became very popular in publications, and the more they are published, the more they are then cited and republished. And then you realize that the other ones kind of have like one publication if you're lucky. A lot of stuff is still unpublished and will be published for the very first time in the platform. And here you can see, of course, also related people. So as I said, I didn't do that work, the coding myself. I was lucky enough to have a friend, Jean-Baptiste Hemer, who is head of a web development company. And I'm citing him for good reason, and his company for good reason, because this was done in the end as a students' project. Apprenticeships are quite a popular way of forming students in Switzerland, and at the end of your apprenticeship you have to do a project, and usually you do a dummy project for your exam, but we decided with my friend to actually do that as a real project that was accepted by the authority for education, and therefore 3 different students in 3 different years could work on the project and developing different aspects of that project. So I really liked it to be able to do it that way and not just hire a company to do that work. So I keep working with them regularly on updates and changes I want to make. I have a whole list of ideas of what I want to do. Funding now is key to keep going, but there is scope for progress in the future. Very briefly, different databases that are working behind the site. Of course, the object is one type of database, the references are a database, the people are a database, and the places being split then between archaeological sites and institutions are a database, but then they are all interlinked, as you could see with the arrows earlier on. But it allows you to search in fun ways and many different ways to find information. So as I spoke about seaware vessels, you can see that I still have a lot of work to do with only 271 vessels available as of, I think today I checked, or yesterday, which is roughly 30% of the corpus. Behind the scenes, what you cannot see online, I have all the others ready in different stages, but I just need to find the time to go through all of them to clean them and make them as good as I want them to be before I make them available online, and that does take a lot of time. Of course, when we do work like that, it gives us the opportunity to contact museums and curators, travel to museums and look at that stuff. And I was lucky enough to be able to do it here as well in the Museo Egizio on a couple of visits, thanks to Christian Greco and of course Federica Uliano. And you have here a few examples of these seawares which are present here in the museum. I'm not sure if not all of these are actually visible in the galleries, but they were all of them, these about 20 seaware vessels in the museums, were found and acquired or acquired by Ernesto Schiaparelli and by Giulio Farina. So keep your eyes open on your next visit in the galleries and in the pre-Dynastic one. And the long gallery with lots of pots in a showcase, you do have some seaware that you can try to find. So when we get to these huge corpus, when we get as much stuff as possible that we can analyze, I think we do increase and get a better understanding of the prevalence of different types, motifs, or how many are figural versus how many are just geometric, etc. We can do that across a type, but then we can reduce that by type, by site, by archaeological site, or by a region, a group of sites as well. I'm not sure that will be done in one click on my platform. I don't want to get ahead of myself. It will still require some thinking from researchers to use it for the different ends and means. But I think we can really progress with that tool. At least that's what I want to do with it. Of course, there are seaware vessels, I said, but there is a lot more now online. These beautiful animal-shaped palettes, for example, are online. Not all of them, because there are hundreds of fish and bird-shaped palettes, which I haven't dealt with yet, but all those that are shaped as horned animals, Barbary sheep or ibex, for example, are online. You will find boat models, you will find little bull head amulets, you will find other types of palettes, and so on. The last thing I want to say about it really is that it's not all me. I certainly don't want to take credit for anybody else's work. It's a collaborative platform. I'm in charge myself of the seaware vessels. I want to do them the red painted vessels because I have all the data for that. But otherwise, I count on colleagues who are interested, who like that kind of geeky approach to the material, to contribute and to be willing to share their data openly with everybody. And at the moment, I can count on Dorian Van Hul and Stan Hendricks, both Belgium colleagues, who share their data. That also gives researchers some visibility, hopefully. There is a page for your biography and your publications that I included, so that hopefully it's it can go both ways. It can help people who contribute as well as they will help the project as it keeps going. And I think I have spoken probably for too long already. So thank you very much for listening tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for... Yes. Thank you so much for your wonderful lecture and for presenting the material, for presenting the wonderful work that you're doing on the database, and for making us appreciating even more 3D Nastic material, but also showing how important it is to link the objects with the data that we have, to consider also the big numbers, what has been published, what is not, how important it is to know the location, how it could be linked to the excavators, the one we're digging, and how it's important to have full references to advance in our knowledge. And also thank you for creating the database and sharing the knowledge, because you're right, we shouldn't be starting from the very beginning every time, but it's very important. I think that is also what digital innovation can do nowadays. Finally, we share knowledge, and it's also interesting because it's at the base of a new definition of museum approved in Prague last year. So, are there questions? Or you're all shy because...
the first one of the year.
Federica, you have questions. I know you do.
No tricky question.
No tricky questions, no. Okay, I have a couple of questions. One is more technical about the database. For the objects that have been purchased on the antiquarian market, are you also adding the info about the dealers?
Yes. So for the provenance, we have the ability to click on archaeological site and add manual information, tomb number, for example. But then I'm also, something I didn't say actually, perhaps because of my work at the Fondation Gandur pour l'Art in Geneva, we are very aware of the importance of pedigree of objects. So when they come from a documented excavation, went straight to a museum, it's easy. But very often it's not the case. Sometimes we don't know where they came from. They went through a series of dealers and collections. Sometimes objects found on excavation were given to people who had privately funded excavations and then went also through a different route. So yes, then I have boxes where I can put the year and the information related to that year in terms of trying to get the full pedigree of an object.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And the second one is more general. And it goes back to the beginning of your lectures, and it's about, artists. I mean, the definition of artists. And do you think it's possible to trace people behind these objects? And so,
that's a good one.
Sorry.
And so, no, it's a good question. I think it's hard to know whether we can trace an actual individual person, because how can you say, oh, it's this one? I mean, they are complex drawings for their time, but they are still quite simple ways of painting, single line and only one color. So to recognize a hand in that would be very difficult. But I know of examples, especially two vessels with hippopotamus on them, and you would think they are made by the same person. You're like, no doubt about that. And yet they are found in two different sites, quite far away from the other. So it doesn't mean it's not the same guy. Did they travel? Did people travel to go see a famous or more, a famous artist and buy or purchase their pot in one place and then leave with it? We don't know at all how that was organized. We know, I don't want to say something wrong, but I believe only of one place where we can say for sure seaware was being made, and that's at Hierakonpolis. It doesn't mean that all of them were made there. No, I'm sure it was done elsewhere, but we have no idea how it was organized. But there are cases where you're like, it's so similar, it must be done by the same person, despite the fact that it's found in different places. But it could also be done by two people who worked alongside one another and just use very similar images.
Ci sono altre domande? Qualcuno vuole fare? Anche in italiano nel caso traduciamo? Nessuno? No questions?
So, sorry for my English, but I would like to know if the animal representations that we seen have a ritual or a magic meaning of, or if they were only a representation of the reality that those people see every day. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I might have skipped a few things because I was not quite following my notes, as you may have noticed all the time. So one thing I may have not mentioned that I probably should have mentioned is that, yes, these, especially when it's figural decoration with animals and people, it's extremely symbolic in nature. Again, they use nature to represent things, but the idea behind that is very different. So one way to explain it is that we only find these more special vessels in elite contexts. So why did the elite choose to do that? I don't think it's just because it's pretty animals. I think if you show yourself killing a hippopotamus and you show yourself alone killing this hippopotamus, you want to show your power. So it is kind of, propaganda is probably not the right term, but it's certainly a way to express power that these early elites had found in these vessels and other. I mean, rock art, we don't speak about rock art, for example, tonight. Upper Egypt is crowded with rock art and representation that should fit in any discussion about art of that period, but it would be, we would still be here next week if we do that. So yes, I think figural decorations are extremely symbolic in nature, mostly about representing power. And you can do that in two ways with these animals. Either you kill the animal and you are more strong, or you owe them, you can destroy this animal. Or in the case of like the nice hippos turning around inside your vessel, they don't look being killed or hunted. And I think you associate yourself with these powerful animals and you kind of take their power in a more different way than by killing and annihilating them. So I think there are two different ways to express the same idea behind of power.
I have a question which immediately also follows on the question that was posed earlier and your answer. I'm wondering what is then, let's say, the moment in which these vessels are used? Is this like tableware? Is this, let's say, a set of particular dishes used in particular festive contexts? Or is this something that is only made to be displayed in a way, to be used as a medium to magically show these kind of rituals and control nature, or is it then just made to be put in the tomb? So where is the Sitz im Leben, as the Germans say, so the daily experience? Yeah.
Wouldn't we all want to know that? Perhaps the first thing to consider is that since Petrie's time, we see these objects as one group because of their technique and representations on them. Is that true for the ancient Egyptians? Did they see all of these vessels in the same way or not? That's one thing I'm not sure, actually. That might be a bias of our time on this material. So I'm not sure there is one single answer for all of these objects, for example. For sure, most of them come from tombs. But as you know, for ancient Egypt, archaeologists have been much more busy excavating tombs with rich objects and numerous objects than they have been excavating settlements. So it's also a bias of our time to think that most of them or all of them are from cemeteries. It might have been also in cemetery as the ultimate fate of the object and yet have been used before. So there are many parameters that we cannot really estimate. For sure, some, and then mostly only as fragments have been found in settlement. But is that because they were made them and they broke it? Is it because you kept them for a few years in your house and they broke it accidentally? I mean, or did they use them to the point that they break? It's hard to know. Very difficult to answer. Tombs that have several seaware are actually very rare. especially to be preserved in a way that you could understand how it was organized. And they tend to be of different types in the same tomb. But to speak of a set, you would need more repeated occasion of that to think it's actually meaningful. Frustratingly, we don't really have the answer. A lot of them have a decoration that's perfectly preserved. Actually, the hippos are on your screen still. I mean, that one is hard to imagine was heavily used, for example, because the paint is still pristine, despite the fact that it was broken probably after it was buried in a tomb. So some might have been used, some might have been displayed, some might have been done for burial immediately. But we don't know. I think we would know more if we excavated a lot more settlement contexts and if we found more production places for these vessels as well.
Altre domande? Ok, se non ci sono altre domande, allora ringraziamo ancora. We thank
you very much.
Xavier
Thank you.
again for your interesting lecture.